Donald Trump has just received an ultimatum from the United States Congress that is unprecedented in modern political history, and I'm not using hyperbole here. Just days ago, Congress issued a final deadline with explicit legal consequences that places the former president between total submission or facing sanctions that no previous occupant of the Oval Office has ever faced. And what makes this absolutely devastating is that this isn't just another partisan squabble that will fade away in the next news cycle. We are talking about a bipartisan coalition in Congress, including conservative old guard Republicans who respect the institutions, who voted to impose this deadline with enforcement mechanisms that Trump can't simply ignore through truth social posts or political rallies. As someone who has spent decades observing and analyzing American politics, covering Watergate as a young journalist, witnessing the Clinton crisis, I can tell you with absolute certainty that what we are witnessing now is different. This is not political theater. This is the American constitutional system testing whether anyone, no matter how powerful or loyal their base, is truly above the law. And believe me, the clock that started ticking the moment Congress issued this ultimatum is sending shockwaves through Washington in a way I have rarely seen. We are seeing real panic in Republican circles, divisions that are fracturing the party before our eyes, and a former president who built his entire political identity on never backing down, never admitting defeat, now facing a choice where all options are catastrophic. It is frankly difficult for me, even after everything I have witnessed in my career, to believe that we have reached this point. But let me bring you up to date on exactly how we got here, and why the next 72 hours could define not only Trump's political future, but the future of accountability in American democracy. Tensions in Washington have been rising for months as Trump and his legal team have employed every tactic imaginable to block congressional investigations. We've seen endless appeals, claims of executive privilege that have no legal basis, lawsuits designed purely to delay, and Trump's signature strategy of treating every court order as just another suggestion he can ignore. But according to Politico's January 8th report, something fundamentally changed when the House Oversight Committee, working with key members of the Senate, voted to impose what they are calling a final compliance deadline. This is not an ordinary subpoena that Trump's lawyers can appeal indefinitely. This was specifically structured after consultations with constitutional experts to close every escape route that Trump has historically exploited. The deadline requires Trump to hand over 8 full years of financial records, including tax returns, bank documents, and correspondence with foreign financial institutions. In addition, it demands his sworn testimony on specific transactions that investigators have already identified as problematic. And here's the critical point. The deadline expires 72 hours from its issuance, with 0 extensions allowed. But this is where the matter transcends ordinary partisan politics and enters serious constitutional territory. The vote to impose this deadline was not along purely partisan lines. According to sources who spoke with CNN, 18 Republicans joined Democrats in passing the measure. These are not moderate Republicans from blue states trying to distance themselves from Trump. We're talking about long-standing conservatives, members who voted with Trump 90% of the time during his presidency. Republican Representative Michael McCaul, chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committee, and someone who has generally defended Trump, was quoted as saying that there has come a point where respecting the institutions of constitutional oversight must supersede political loyalty. That's extraordinary. When members of Trump's own party are speaking publicly about institutions versus loyalty, you know that something fundamental has changed. And then came the moment that changed the entire political calculation. When the deadline was formally announced in the House plenary session, it included an annex detailing the specific consequences of non-compliance. Not the usual vague language about possible sanctions. We are talking about legal specificity that was clearly drafted by constitutional lawyers who wanted to avoid any ambiguity. If Trump does not comply within 72 hours, Congress will immediately initiate contempt proceedings. This is not civil contempt where you simply pay a fine. This is criminal contempt that may result in arrest warrants issued by the sergeant at arms. In addition, Congress reserves the right to refer the matter to the Department of Justice for further criminal prosecution for obstruction of justice. Trump's reaction was predictable in its fury but revealing in its tone. In a series of posts on Truth Social, which began minutes after the deadline was announced, Trump called this a deep state coup and an unprecedented witch hunt. He specifically attacked the Republicans who voted in favor, calling them traitors and rhinos who would pay a political price. But what caught my attention, and the attention of experienced analysts I know in Washington, was what Trump didn't say. There was none of the usual bravado of, "I will never submit," or "let them come for me." Instead, there were vague references to consulting with my lawyers and exploring all legal options. For someone who has followed Trump's rhetoric for years, that vacillation is significant. And the leaks from his inner circle, reported by NBC News on January 9th, paint a picture of utter chaos. Multiple sources described emergency meetings at Mar-a-Lago, where Trump's lawyers explained to him in no uncertain terms that this time is different. There is no appeal available because Congress structured this under its constitutional oversight powers that the Supreme Court has repeatedly confirmed. A senior lawyer reportedly told Trump directly, "Sir, this is not a court order that we can appeal. This is Congress exercising fundamental constitutional authority. If you defy this, I cannot represent you in what comes next." That lawyer, according to sources, is not the only one considering resigning if Trump persists in full-scale defiance. Now let me put this into historical perspective, because as a lifelong student of American politics, the precedents here are profoundly important. This is not the first time we have seen confrontations between Congress and a president or former president over documents and testimony. But the way this is playing out has unique elements that should concern all Americans regardless of party affiliation. Consider the case of Richard Nixon during Watergate. In July 1974, the Supreme Court unanimously ordered Nixon to turn over the White House tapes. Nixon faced a similar choice: comply or defy. He chose to comply, understanding that defying the Supreme Court would destroy any remaining political support he had. 2 weeks later, he resigned when it became clear that impeachment was inevitable. The critical difference here is that Nixon still had political options. He could resign with some dignity. He could negotiate a pardons. Trump doesn't have those escape routes because he no longer holds office, and because this Congress has made it clear that there is no negotiation available. The deadline is absolute. Then there's the case of Bill Clinton during the Lewinsky investigation. Clinton initially resisted testifying before the grand jury, but eventually did so after it became clear that claiming executive privilege for personal matters wouldn't hold up. Clinton chose calculated compliance, giving testimony but being careful with his words. He survived politically because he cooperated just enough to avoid accusations of total obstruction. Trump has repeatedly shown that he is incapable of that kind of calibrated compliance. His pattern is total defiance or nothing. And that pattern is precisely why Congress structured this deadline the way it did, with no room for half measures. Trump now faces an impossible choice. And as an analyst who has studied his political psychology for years, I can tell you there is no good option for him. On the one hand, he can comply, turn over the documents, give his testimony, and submit to the authority of Congress. But that destroys his entire political narrative. His whole brand is built on being someone who never backs down, who never submits to the establishment. If his supporters see him turning over documents to Congress after years of calling it a witch hunt, that fundamentally undermines his appeal. The MAGA base loves him specifically because he defies the norms and institutions they see as corrupt. Compliance is admitting that those institutions have legitimate authority over him. That is unacceptable to the persona he built. On the other hand, he can defy the deadline, refuse to comply, and dig in for an all-out confrontation with Congress. That maintains his fighter image and likely solidifies his space. But the legal consequences would be immediate and severe. We're talking arrest warrants, criminal prosecution, the very real possibility of jail time. And here's the fundamental problem. His advisors are desperately trying to make him understand. Once Congress issues an arrest warrant for contempt, it's not something he can stop with social media posts or rallies. Federal agents with a warrant would come and arrest him. The Secret Service can't interfere with a lawful order from Congress. We'd be seeing images of a former president in handcuffs. His political advisors are similarly divided. Some argue that defiance is the only politically viable option, that his base will abandon him if he submits. Others insist that being arrested for contempt of Congress would destroy his chances in 2024, that undecided voters would see that as validation that he's out of control. Meanwhile, the Republican Party is fracturing in real time over how to respond. According to Politico, Senate Republican leaders held emergency calls trying to formulate a coherent response. Some wanted to defend Trump and attack Congress for alleged overreach. Others argued that the party needs to distance itself before the ship sinks completely. Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell, who has a notoriously complicated relationship with Trump, reportedly remained silent during these calls. That silence is telling. McConnell understands that whichever path the Republican Party chooses here has profound long-term consequences. If Republicans defend Trump's defiance of Congress's authority, they are effectively arguing that constitutional oversight is illegitimate when directed at their own party. That undermines decades of Republican positions on separation of powers and checks and balances. But if they abandon Trump, they risk the fury of a base that remains fiercely loyal to him. The next 72 hours will define not only Trump's legal future, but something much bigger. It will determine whether American institutions can function when challenged by someone willing to completely disregard rules and processes. It will determine whether Congress's oversight means anything, or if it's just theater that the powerful can ignore. As Americans, regardless of party, we must ask ourselves what kind of system we want. Do we want one where legal authority can be effectively ignored by those who have enough political support? Or do we want one where institutions have the capacity to enforce accountability even against the powerful? True conservatives understand that limited but effective institutions are essential to preventing tyranny. If we undermine those institutions because they are being used against someone we politically support, we are abandoning fundamental conservative principles in favor of mere partisan tribalism. I have dedicated my life to observing and analyzing American politics, And I tell you in all seriousness that this moment is as consequential as anything I have ever witnessed. The decisions made in the coming days will resonate for decades, shaping how American institutions function and whether the rule of law truly applies equally. The stakes have never been higher. The countdown has never been more absolute. And the consequences for American democracy have never been more profound. What Trump chooses and what we allow to become precedent will define whether the United States remains a nation of laws or becomes something fundamentally different.